Mark, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm an associate professor of religious studies and theology at Stonehill College here in Easton, Massachusetts.
Cool. So the topic today is the problem of evil. I am an atheist, of course, so I think the problem of evil is fairly successful at demonstrating that there can't be an all-good, all-powerful God. Could you tell me your thoughts on the problem of evil and how it relates to the existence of God?
Sure, the problem of evil is one of these perennial questions that arises in every generation in response to the realities of unjust suffering and evil. And so people of a religious persuasion try to reconcile the reality of evil, the reality of unjust suffering, with their religious beliefs, specifically their belief in divine omnipotence and divine omnibenevolence or goodness. So that's the crux of the problem of evil. And theodicy is the attempt to try to explain how an all good, all powerful God could allow evil in the universe. And it gives morally sufficient, plausible explanations for why evil might exist.
Cool. And so could you tell me, like, what is your response to the problem of evil? So I think that obviously there is evil in the world, and
Mm,
if God is perfect, why would he allow evil is the main question. And if he's capable of preventing it and doesn't, then
mhm.
he might probably isn't very good. If he's not capable, then he's not all powerful, and then the whole Epicurus thing.
Right, right. The statement of the problem of evil from Epicurus to David Hume to C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis talked about how the problem of evil is the strongest card in the enemy's hand, he said in a letter in 1946. And of course, it's been called the rock of atheism. So it presents a really compelling reason for atheism. And I think what theists try to do, and Christians in particular, is to try to propound theories that might give a reasonable explanation. So, for instance, the free will defense, which will be very familiar to you, argues that the misuse of freedom is the reason why evil exists, and freedom is such a great good that it provides the morally sufficient reason why God might permit evil. And then you have other options such as John Hick's soul-making theodicy. And soul-making theodicy argues that evil and suffering are necessary for our moral, intellectual, and spiritual growth, that without obstacles, without challenges to overcome, indeed without suffering, we would never grow. And you might think of process more recently. Process theodicy argues that evil exists because God can't prevent it, because God's not omnipotent. And so that's another option that draws from process philosophy and theology, Alfred North Whitehead and David Ray Griffin. And you can also, from a uniquely Christian standpoint, you could look at various cruciform theodicies. Think of Marilyn McCord Adams or Jürgen Moltmann, who talk about the ways in which the suffering of God with the world, the suffering of God by the world, and the suffering of God for the world represents the highest forms of God's creative love. And so a cruciform theodicy, or a theodicy that focuses on the cross as the centerpiece for how a Christian might explain evil, sees the suffering of Christ on the cross, the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me, as a real center point and a way in which God inhabits suffering. God's answer to suffering is to inhabit it with us, and also points to the redemptive possibilities of suffering. So Marilyn McCord Adams, for instance, will say that from the vantage point of the beatific vision, the face-to-face encounter with God, that no one will wish away any of their life's history, including her category horrendous evils. And John Hick also kind of famously says, no theodicy without eschatology. So a lot of Christian theodicies in particular invoke eschatology, ultimately notions of heaven and hell, to try to balance the scales of justice that are imbalanced here on earth.
So my general take on the problem of evil is that if there is one logically possible world to attain all of the goods without the evil, then that would prove that God can't be perfectly good because he didn't create that world as opposed to this one. And I think there is such a logically possible world. I think you can take all of the arguments you mentioned and make a moral world that has all of those,
Mm,
but with one extra condition that makes it more moral, which is becomes optional. So if you
mm,
give each entity, conscious agent, the option, here is a world that has soul building or a free will or whatever, and you have the choice. You can enter this world with the suffering and this benefit, or you can choose to go to your own world and not have to deal with that. Um, and then that person can choose whether they want the soul building or end suffering, or they just want to go
mm,
play video games.
mm,
That world would be a logically possible world that is more moral than forcing beings into the soul building world without their
mm,
consent.
mm.
Therefore, because God did not create that world, God must not be perfectly moral.
Yeah, that sounds to me you're articulating a kind of anti-theodicy, which is an important approach in this discussion, which argues that theodicy fails because it can't possibly succeed because it doesn't address the problem of evil, doesn't successfully neutralize the problem of evil. And so people become anti theodicists, saying that it both fails logically and it fails morally as well. I think whatever perspective you come at, ultimately humans are meaning making creatures. And so what theodicy does is attempt cosmic repair to try to think about the world in a way that restores cosmic coherence. And so all of these systems, all of these theodicies and anti-theodicies, I think are ultimately an effort to help us live in a world where things happen that jar us, that puncture our sacred canopies. That's why when you turn on the news and you see all of the terrible things that happen, say a school shooting, the first question people ask after the who and what happened is why. They want to know why. And I think it's because we are such meaning making creatures. And so we want to have these frameworks in which to inhabit intellectually. And I think that's true for the theist or atheist alike.
Oh, for sure. But I think that, like, it seems to me that the atheist side has a significant advantage here on the arguments. Like, anybody can make up arguments and ad hoc criterion to try to shoehorn in their particular ideology.
Mm,
But as long as there is a single logically possible world to achieve whatever the benefit is without the consequence, that seems to undercut all possible theodicies about the problem of evil.
Yeah, no, I enjoy reading those kind of anti-theodical approaches, and I think it's a valuable part of the discussion. What I often try to do in my reading and research and teaching on theodicy is sort of survey the terrain, give a sense of, well, what are the various options out there, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each, and to sort of function as an umpire to call balls and strikes in terms of methodologies, in terms of interrogating the presuppositions and implications of assertions. And so whenever I talk to people who espouse a theodicy, what's interesting is it's both coming from intellectual paradigms that they have from whatever background they come at, but also usually moral and ethical sensibilities that are driving it in particular ways. And so it's often very experiential um, when I'm engaging with people on what theodicies they find compelling. For my part, I don't think there's any silver bullet theodicy or kind of one theodicy to rule them all. I think each, merits consideration. Each has vulnerabilities, and all theodicies, I think, are ultimately going to be provisional and incomplete and tentative.
So you mentioned that you would come at this from a perspective of talking to people about what they find morally significant in their presuppositions. How would you approach,
Mhm.
like, could you give an example of how you would approach that in a perspective in the perspective of a conversation?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. Someone once lost their fiance and uh, came up to me and asked them, why would God allow this to happen? She was so good, I am so bad. Why am I still here and she's not? I think those are the kinds of questions that occur naturally to people when they're in the midst of suffering. And Nicholas Wolterstorff has a similar experience when he talks in Lament for a Son about it's sort of like incomplete puzzle pieces. Nicholas Wolterstorff loses his son Eric in a mountain climbing accident, and that's a huge piece of the puzzle of his life. And then he still is a theist. He was a philosopher of religion at Yale Divinity School and Yale University, and he says, "I cannot put these pieces together. I do not know why God would watch him fall. I do not know why God would watch me wounded. I can't even guess." And um, so I think the experiential background of the person and the kinds of suffering that they've endured always inform this question. It never comes from a neutral place. I have found it's always inflected by not just their philosophical and theological presuppositions, but also their experiences. That's what C.S. Lewis said in the letter. He said, when I was an atheist because my mother died when I was young, and I was bullied in school and because of World War I. And he says, but even the common kind of rung of experience is a good grounds to be an atheist. And eventually he became a theist, but thinking about evil in those terms, I think demonstrates Lewis is a good example of someone whose atheism he explicitly links to his experience, not just his theoretical orientations.
Do you think that those biases could essentially just be an example of confirmation bias, where the problem of evil is just trying to use your biases to make your worldview fit the inconsistencies you see?
That's always a danger, I think. I wouldn't frame it in terms of bias. I would frame it more in terms of context, that everyone's coming from an intellectual experiential context. And the danger of that, I agree, is that we tend to want to just reinforce and justify our existing context rather than explore another. So I think the problem of confirmation bias is always one to consider, which is why it's helpful to adopt the kind of Platonic maxim, we must go where the argument leads. And I think that's a good approach in thinking about theodicy and the problem of evil.
Do you think that arguments are vague enough that you can make arguments for essentially any position, and it's hard to evaluate from arguments alone which position is the more rational?
Each theodicy, think of soul-making theodicy, has its own inner coherence. It has its own internal, internal justification and intellectual infrastructure, philosophical infrastructure, theological assumptions. And so, I think the more compelling the theodicy, the more specific those arguments should be, the more explicit the infrastructure, and also the counter arguments, I think, have to be considered. So, for instance, with soul-making theodicy and John Ross says the problem with soul-making theodicy is that John Hick sees the world too much as a schoolroom where people grow and learn, when it's actually more like a dangerous alley, which is another way of saying that suffering is not always productive for growth, which of course we know. So yeah, I think vagueness is a detriment to a theodicy and renders it less compelling. I think the more compelling theodicies are really grounded in their specific sacred texts, philosophical interlocutors, and are able to surface and show how these are the building blocks of whatever theory that they propound. But there is always the problem of hiding behind theory or theory whitewashing both the horrific reality of evil and perhaps the fact that if you need that much theory to try to explain why God is how he's conceived to be in classical theism, maybe that's a bad sign. I could see, because it could seem like too much fancy footwork conceptually.
So two questions there. Could you give an example of some of the ones that you mentioned were the better theodicies? And is it possible to use theories in this way to make any hypothesis work, essentially? So there's no limit to how much you can use the fancy footwork to make your ideology seem reasonable.
Yeah. I personally wouldn't rank theodicies in the sense that I wouldn't say, well, this is the most internally consistent or the most philosophically airtight or the most theologically compelling. I would say the ones that surface in my research most often are the free will defense. It surfaces quite often. Certainly, soul making process, anti-theodicies come up, but I think global. I think we're moving away from the day of global theodicies, and a lot of the work in theodicy that I see is more on a micro level. So I wouldn't rank them per se. I think from the perspective of a Christian theodicy, if evil is the rock of atheism, then I would say Christ would have to be the cornerstone of a Christian theodicy, and specifically the cross. So I think any compelling Christian theodicy would have to really focus on what are the what's the nature and significance and implication of the suffering of Christ. But that won't have heuristic value for, say, a Muslim theodicy or a Jewish theodicy per se. So that's where each world religion has to formulate and craft their response to the problem of evil and suffering within their own worldview, within their own sacred literature. And that's why I think global theodicies are becoming less and less compelling.
So my second question was, can you use the fancy footwork to make any ideology work, essentially?
That's always a danger. I think it's anytime you're using complex theory and grandiloquent language and kind of retreating behind a lot of jargon, the danger of that is that it's obscuring. It's obscuring truth, because truth should be simple, should be easily stated. And so that is a danger, I would say, that as theodicies become increasingly complex, increasingly jargon filled, and there's no way of talking about it without invoking the jargon. I mean, theodicy itself is a neologism from the Greek words theos and dike, God and justice. So there's no way of avoiding the jargon. But a theory itself, if you can't simplify the theory and articulate what it's trying to say, then I think it's vulnerable to that objection that it's obscuring the fact that theism has failed to produce, to justify the ways of God to men, to use John Milton's Paradise Lost formulation.
You mentioned the micro level. I imagine by that you mean like the specifics of the particular religious doctrine, like you said, Jesus and the cross.
Right,
And
or a particular, yeah. So micro, or in the sense of either a particular part of the argument or within a particular religion, because to talk about Christianity, well, that's a monolithic category. You think about the branches of Christianity: Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodoxy. All of them, even within Christianity, would configure the problem of evil slightly differently. So it's a way of bringing the problem into the particularities of those communities and those theologies, even within a world religion.
And you mentioned Jesus on the cross. How would that relate to the problem of suffering?
Jürgen Moltmann, in his Crucified God, really focuses on the importance of what he calls the theodicy question. And he says the theodicy question is something we can't answer in this life, nor can we evade it. And for him, the suffering of Christ on the cross exemplifies, in his mind, the love of God, exemplifies God's response to evil and suffering, which is to inhabit it, to embody it, and provides what he thinks is the highest form of God's creative love with humanity. And this is coming from someone, Jürgen Moltmann, who was an atheist. He was a prisoner of war in the Second World War, and then, as he was in a Allied prison camp, he came to this realization of a God who is love, of Christ who is a brother, and that for him transformed his thinking about the problem of evil and suffering.
It seems like a strange solution. So God created suffering, but it's okay because he caused himself to suffer. It seems like Two
Yeah, I
wrongs don't
don't
make a
think he
right.
would say no. Yeah, I see what you mean. I don't think Moltmann would say God created suffering. Moltmann would probably subscribe to a free will defense notion of the origin of evil, that evil somehow is derivative of the misuse of freedom. So even his sort of cruciform approach or focus on theodicy that has to do with the cross would also bring in things like the free will elements of the free will defense to explain the origin of evil.
So I never really understood the free will defense because it seems
Mm,
quite easily logically possible to have free will without suffering. So why
mm.
would having how does exactly having free will in any way solve the problem of suffering when it seems very easily that we could all have free will without suffering?
Yeah, I guess the counter argument to that is that any sort of robust notion of freedom, any idea of an authentic freedom that admits of genuine choice will always involve the possibility of choosing against the good and of choosing against God. And so you couldn't have genuine, authentic, real freedom without the possibility of error, without the possibility of fall. And and so the concept of a suffering-free freedom, or a freedom without the option to go astray, would be a kind of desiccated notion of freedom. So I think it turns on how you define freedom.
From my perspective, it's like I can't fly. Like I can't just choose to fly whenever I want. So free will doesn't mean the freedom to do anything you want at any time.
Right, right.
And there are many humans like Stephen Hawking, who was a quadriplegic, who
Hmm.
couldn't punch someone in the face if they wanted to. But that would probably be put into the same class of things as me not being able to fly. It's not an infringement of either of our free will. We both still have free will. And so we could imagine a extra law of physics of some kind that essentially makes it impossible for anybody to punch anybody else in the face. They just
Hmm.
become a ghost or something. Your fist would pass through them, and so it would just be um,
Yeah, every time
ethereal.
you tried to stab someone, the knife would disappear, and bullets would turn to Nerf bullets, and that sort of multiverse world where the execution of freedom would always be in the context of a harmless outcome. And I think that's a real thought experiment. Alvin Plantinga talks about humans being sometimes significantly free. So, like you said, we're not free to just fly because I want to fly, but we're sometimes significantly free. And then I think, yeah, the crux of the debate is, does authentic, genuine, real freedom require the possibility of hurting someone else, or does the actualization of our freedom always require the possibility of hindering or harming another person's freedom? And it sounds like you're saying you can imagine a world where people could be sometimes significantly free without the possibility of them ever doing any harm to
Well, I'd
anyone.
go a step further and I'd say if I want to make it, because the point of the argument is using this world as a
Mm,
kind of anthropocentric grounding of evil. Like this world is the one that has the good, whatever it happens to be. So if I try to make my analogy as close to this world as possible,
mm,
um, I must also entail whatever the goodness quality is. And so if I say tomorrow we were all made quadriplegics,
mm,
um, that would seem to be to not in any way inhibit free will because there are people who are quadriplegics. And so if being a quadriplegic infringed upon your free will, then not everyone would have free will, and that would kind of defeat the whole point of the argument. So Stephen Hawking has to have free will. And if we all had the same condition as Stephen Hawking were quadriplegic, we'd all still have to have free will, but no one would be able to punch anybody. It would be
mm,
impossible for one person to punch another person.
mm,
And so, in that context, it seems like the ability to punch someone else in the face is not in any way required in order to have free will, because Stephen Hawking has free will. And if we were all quadriplegic, we would all still have free will. And
mm,
so, it seems like there's many ways to use the conditions that are allowed in this world as we know it, that don't infringe on free will, but we can use them in such a way that makes the world a better place without infringing on free will. Therefore, free will doesn't apply a justification for why God didn't do that.
mm. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. You're articulating a kind of reasonable possible world where the execution of freedom doesn't have to come at the expense of the other, kind of innocuous notion of freedom. I just think a free will defender would say that that's restricting the moral range of freedom to the point that you define freedom out of existence. I think that's probably how they would respond to these kind of dueling notions of freedom. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to exercise our freedom? And if we exercised our freedom in a way that could never violate any moral law against our fellow man or against nature or ourselves, would that be a viable or real notion of freedom? My guess is that the debate would turn on that.
But they would typically grant that Stephen Hawking has free will, right? And so if all you're doing is applying similar restrictions to other people that Stephen Hawking has, that can't, by logically can't infringe on free will. Because if it did, then Stephen Hawking must not have free will.
Yeah, I think they wouldn't restrict free will to the physical exercise of freedom and or the complete. It's not. I don't think the free will defender would say that um, freedom, authentic freedom, involves the complete physical actualization of freedom. You know, I think they would recognize that sometimes freedom is impaired by all sorts of things, physical and psychological and mental. I think Plantinga would talk about, are we significantly free? Is there significant freedom? But then, of course, a counterpoint to that would be that we can think of times and places where people's freedoms were curtailed to the point where you could question whether they were significantly free enough to make meaningful choices.
Yeah, so I would like I know that there's the thought crime thing where like if you covet another man's wife, you've committed a sin. And that part I'm as an atheist, I don't see that as a sin. So I'm fine to keep
Mm,
all of that stuff, all of
mm,
the yelling at God, disagreeing with God. But it seems like in this case, the ability to punch someone else in the face or stab someone, those seem to be unnecessary. Those don't seem to be relevant to a significant amount of freedom because Stephen
mhm,
Hawking didn't have them. But everyone I've talked to said yes, Stephen Hawking paraplegics, they still have free will.
mhm.
Doesn't infringe on free will. And so it seems like we could add an extra law of physics that would do something similar and make it impossible under certain conditions to stab someone, which would essentially make you a paraplegic, but nothing more. And therefore, that law couldn't violate free will because it's only doing something that's already taking place in this universe. And so it's while I could grant we couldn't get rid of all evil as defined in the Bible, including thought crime, because that would definitely infringe on free will if you can't think
Mhm.
whatever you want to think. The physical aspect seems like it could be limited to a significantly more than it has been without infringing free will. And the fact that that hasn't been done seems to prove that God isn't perfectly moral because a perfectly moral being would have done that because it's gratuitous suffering that God added into this world that is unnecessary for free will.
Right. Yeah, no, I think I understand what you're saying. I'm trying to understand, given my assumption that all people, regardless of religious affiliation or persuasion or not, are trying to operate within these meaning-making systems, I'd be interested in asking you, so what would be a typical, in your view, atheist approach to the problem of evil and trying to explain it and articulate what it means to live in a world with evil? So how would an atheist approach that? I'm just trying to uh, compare that to sort of theistic accounts that I've read more about.
So I am a moral realist. Most atheist philosophers are. So I think it's like
Mhm.
the Phil Survey's paper said 75% of academic philosophers were atheists, but 65 believe in moral realism or something. So I believe there is a objective standard of morality, and violations
Right.
of that standard would be evil in this context, immoral
Okay.
actions. And so I think, from my view, a perfectly moral world would be a world where it'd be impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing.
Hmm.
That's a perfectly moral world. Um, Thought crime wouldn't be immoral in my view. I don't think you can think whatever you want, totally fine. Doesn't matter what it is. Play video games. You can do whatever you want in a video game. Never going to be immoral. And so I would think that
Because it's not externalized, it's not immoral. Because as long as you don't externalize it, it has no reality.
well, I think morality is an involuntary imposition of will. And so if
Yeah.
you infringe on someone else's will, their freedom, their property, that would be immoral. But as long as you haven't done that, you haven't done anything immoral. And so you can do whatever you want with your own mind, your own thoughts, because that's not an infringement of somebody else's mind or their thoughts in any way. Therefore, it would never be immoral by my definition. So go
So
ahead.
would you be a human? Would you define yourself more as a humanist, or is it a distinction without a difference?
Well, I wrote my own model of morality, so I wouldn't specifically fit into those kinds of things, but I
Right.
might be considered a humanist. I don't know.
Right. Okay. So would you say an atheist approach or humanist approach to evil would be um, essentially ethics, which is to say to try to alleviate evil, to try to eliminate evil, to try to work towards higher forms of justice, rather than having it fit into a metaphysical model?
Um, Typically, yes, but mine is definitely a metaphysical model. I'm a moral realist, so I think this is like
Right.
a feature of reality that there is some objective criterion of
Mhm.
morality. But I think typically most average atheist humanists think of it more as like a ethics thing where we're trying to just build a better world kind of a thing.
Do you think atheists can join with theists and toward that effort? Do you think that's possible
Sure,
or advisable? Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Very good.
Why? What was your impetus to that question? Do you think that that
Well,
is
well, sometimes when the debates between atheists and theists get so vitriolic and polemical, and they start to just otherize the other camp, then I think it becomes impossible. But if you can see every other person as someone who has inherent value, someone who is a potential brother or sister or fellow quester in life, and who you could join with to try to bring about some specific good, then I think you can move beyond uh, the kind of polemics into something more ethical, examples of trying to alleviate poverty, for example, things like that. So, but I'm trying to think. I don't know if I see a lot of examples of it, of examples between partnerships between atheists and theists, and I'd like to see more of that, I guess.
Oh, definitely. I think that one of the examples here is that there's a nonprofit organization called the Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing Fund, where they buy apartment buildings and offer them at affordable rates for
Mm-hmm.
tenants. And I'm trying to start an atheist church organization to do something similar, where we buy apartment buildings and do that for the same thing. And I think that if all churches in America did that, that would essentially solve the housing problem. So what I wish churches had applied this standard and started doing that kind of things. But I think that there are many secular and Christian religious organizations that are working towards the same ends, even if they're
Right,
not working together. So there's many humanist organizations who feed the homeless kind of a thing,
right.
and there are many
Yeah.
Christian organizations who feed the homeless. And so even if they aren't
And that's
working
the common
directly,
ground. That's the
yeah,
common ground they can stand on and work within when their metaphysical or theological or philosophical worlds are incompatible.
right. But I think that there is common ground in some of the goals, but there's also another aspect where there's divergent,
Yeah,
contradicting views. For
of
example,
course.
abortion
Right.
or gay marriage or LGBT rights. There are many different areas where there probably will need to be an answer. One side is right, one side is wrong, so that we
Hmm.
can progress forward. And the question, I think, of the problem of evil is a good starting point to try to evaluate one side, particularly the theist side, I think is incorrect on some of these things. And one of the weaknesses expressed by that is expressed by discussing the problem of evil and showing that there is a better way the world could be. And that's the way I would describe it, as a world where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. I think that would be a more moral framework to base what we should aspire to be in the world. And
Right.
if we use that framework, we can say, here's what a perfectly moral world would look like. And if God existed, this is the world he would have created. And since he
And
didn't,
the problem of evil is also a great unifier, thinking about experience, because everyone suffers. If they live long enough and love deeply enough, people suffer and they suffer deeply, and that can become a point of identification, a common ground that we can meet each other on, the experience of suffering, and what to do in the midst of suffering, how we can be present to each other in suffering, and the ways in which we can bring relief. And so I think that's very much a common ground as well.
Oh, absolutely. The challenge is that many of the arguments, like the free will defense and the soul building defense, seem to be more saying, no, you should suffer. You must suffer. We're
Well,
not going to alleviate the suffering. You need to suffer. And
it's
that to me
interesting.
seems.
Yeah, it's interesting. This happens a lot when there's a natural disaster. Unfortunately, a kind of punishment theodicy or blame the victim, that they're suffering because of some real or perceived particular sin, and that approach is obviously unhelpful. And the Book of Job is a text worthy to study that problematizes that approach. But I find people in the crucible of suffering, people who are really suffering deeply, are not as interested in philosophical or theological disquisitions. I find what they're really interested in is you being there, your presence, practical aid. It's the old adage, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think when you're really in the midst of suffering, that becomes vividly true. That, and it's not that the questions cease their importance, but it becomes a different environment to, more applied theology or applied philosophy in those moments.
Right, I would agree, but I think that the background knowledge impacts how you try to help people in those situations. So, like Mother
Mhm.
Teresa, I think is a really big example. Christopher Hitchens did not like Mother Teresa very much. He was very
Oh,
opposed
really? Why is
to Mother
that?
Teresa because when she was asked if she could eliminate suffering or if she could have imposed different policies to help alleviate the suffering, would she have done it? She said no. She said the
Hmm.
suffering was good. It was character building. It was something that was a part of the world, that we did this because we're to blame from Adam and Eve eating the apples, et cetera, et cetera. And so she
Uh,
wasn't trying to solve the suffering. She was
mhm.
there to give comfort emotionally, or the soul comfort, not actually trying to help people to get them out of suffering or to get them out of poverty, but just to try to be there for them in their suffering, because the suffering was something that was ordained by God to help benefit the world in some way. And so I think that having the perspective that suffering is a requirement for free will or for soul building or for because we did it to ourselves, it's our fault, for because we misuse our freedom, or because Adam and Eve ate the apple, it seems shallow to me. And
Hmm.
that a more moral perspective is to see that this is something we should not accept, that we should fight against it, that we should stop it, and that it could have been stopped, that there are ways to stop it, that there are better ways the world could be. And to
Yeah.
not simply say that, well, God designed it this way for some perfect benefit, and this is the Leibniz best possible world kind of a thing,
Right.
that this is bad and it shouldn't be this way. And if someone did design it this way, they should be fired.
But I'm just reading a quote from the Blessed Mother Teresa of Calcutta: "Love to be real, it must cost, it must hurt, it must empty us of self." And I think in these moments of, so I take your kind of anti-theodical point that a more moral approach would be to try to alleviate suffering, to fix the injustices and the systems that perpetuate suffering. I think that's a good point. But I think, at least interpersonally, one on one, if you're with someone who's suffering, there's no precondition of a kind of harmonized worldview for that to be a productive interchange. So it's not as if when I'm with someone who's suffering deeply, I ask myself, do we see the world the same? Do we have the same metaphysics? Um, it's more about being willing to enter into it um, from where they are. And that sense of radical presence, I think you find in the Book of Job with Job's friends in uh, Job 2 at the end, when they sat with him 7 days and 7 nights and no one said a word because they saw that his suffering was very great. And I think where the friends go wrong in the Book of Job is after the prose prologue and the poetic dialogue in 3 to 37, when they start trying to explain things. And if you think about these moments when someone's suffering, if you try to explain to it either within a theodical or anti-theodical framework, I think it misses the opportunity to really be there in a radical way. Radical presence is a real solution. Whereas evil, when you think about evil, if you frame it as a mystery, then you can say, in the words of T.S. Eliot, that you don't explain a mystery, you ponder it. And I think there's something similar when you're with someone who's suffering. You don't have to explain their suffering. You can just inhabit it with them to the best of your ability.
Oh, right. I would agree from the perspective of trying to relate to people in suffering. But I think that my point was more, what do you do when you come to someone who is suffering? So say Adam and Eve ate
Mm,
the apple, they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and now they're suffering. My solution is open up the gates to Eden and let them back in. Problem
mm,
solved.
mhm.
Whereas if you think God is right and God is good and he made the right decisions, the theist in that position probably wouldn't do that. They probably wouldn't try to overrule God's decision and say, we'll just fix your suffering. Your suffering has some purpose to it. So you have to, like, I'm here to be with you in the suffering, but I'm not going to fix it for you because this is something God ordained.
Mm.
That to me seems like a problem. I think that,
Wait, but
uh,
do you think we can fix the world? See, it wouldn't
yeah,
occur to me. You think we can?
yes.
If we mobilize enough people, if we, maybe I'm more Augustinian where I'm sort of pessimistic about what can be done, but so what would it take? Mobilizing people around a right way of thinking about the world and their moral agency. Um, you would have to, I would think, mobilize religion or eliminate it in order to make that work.
Well, there's actually many different ways to do it. One is just once you get artificial intelligence, it can solve most of the problems on its own, won't even need
Mm,
us. But like the example I gave before is like if churches actually made a concerted effort to
mm.
provide affordable housing instead of Joel Osteen buying 10 private jets and Kenneth
Salvation with a
Copeland.
smile, Joel Osteen.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So like,
Wait a minute. Have you spoken at a lot of churches to try to propound this theory of partnership? Yeah.
yes. I don't know
How does
like
that
theory of
go?
partnership. Well, like most of the Christians,
Yeah.
I say, yes, you're right. That's absolutely an amazing thing. We should totally do that. So the church typically agrees, though getting them to give up their money is much more difficult.
Well, there's finance committees and boards and yeah, that's more
Yeah,
complicated. Purse
yeah,
strings. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, typically they all agree that yes, we should be doing more to like provide housing. And I can say, hey, here's some organizations that do that. We could copy them. But the
Mm,
difficulty is getting them to actually, instead of building a new church with a giant theater and some like
mhm.
amphitheater music stuff and some guitars, like no, we're gonna spend it on this stuff instead of housing. That seems to be the more difficult part. But typically they all tend to agree that we should be doing more to help
So
people.
they're receptive to this message.
Yeah.
Mm, yeah.
And so that would be another way that we could move the world closer to fixing the problems of the world by getting, because there are so many churches that are very well funded. They
That's interesting.
could,
You definitely, it sounds like you take a more kind of macro systemic approach, which I think is good and helpful. My approach, I think, has always been kind of mind to mind, heart to heart, the people in the trenches with me. That's all I can influence. That's where my world is. But you have a kind of bigger picture for how to mobilize. Well, I guess your YouTube channel would be an example of that.
sure, sure. And
Mhm.
I think that would be a more beneficial way if more people looked at the world that way, as
Yeah.
this is something we can solve instead of just trying to comfort people who are
Mhm.
suffering, trying to fix the suffering. Let's stop the suffering in the first place. That would seem to be a
Mhm.
better solution than simply trying to accommodate people or be there for people in emotional need. Let's just fix it. Let's just stop it. Because I think we can cure starvation. Like that's something we can cure. The what's it? The EU made a goal to cut poverty in half in 20 years, and they accomplished it. It wasn't even that hard. It's pretty easy to make big changes once we put the
But
goals in the right place.
isn't the obstacle, one of the obstacles to that is not just finite resources, obviously, and complicated power structures and decision-making structures, but also self-interest. That people are self-interested, nations are self-interested. So you have to find a way to give them a vision to help them transcend their self-interest.
Yeah, I think that's where like artificial intelligence is going to be a key feature to this because it's going to
Mm,
maximize or make economies significantly more efficient in how they're operated and not specifically on greed and giving yourself bonuses and stock buybacks.
right.
But it seems like most of the world's problems can be solved through science and technology and have been being solved. Like we've
I heard
crippled
that
life expectancy.
AI scanned a bunch of heart scans, 10,000 or something, and could anticipate which people were going to have heart events, and the doctors don't know how or why they were able to do that, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah,
They-
yeah. AI is going to be better at us than at pretty much everything.
mm,
That's what we've learned. People used to say it's impossible that a computer will be able to beat a human at chess. Well, look how
mhm,
that turned out. So it seems as we gain technologically, all of the aspects of human suffering are going to be relatively trivial to solve. Like aging, probably going to be able to solve that because we
mm,
know there's many animals that don't age. We know there's many animals that are essentially immune to cancer, like elephants. Elephants very, very rarely ever get cancer because of the way their genes work. And we can,
mm,
if we understand more about how to use CRISPR and gene modification and how nature works, we will be able to modify our faulty bodies and fix them so that they work better. So we
mm,
won't have these problems and we'll be able to create enough resources to feed the world and we'll be able to have housing for everybody. And so it seems like much of the problems of this world aren't fundamental to reality or fundamental to human nature. They're all contingent on lack of resources and lack of the ability to divide those resources among people's needs, and it seems like those are very solvable problems. Like we can fix this, we can
mm.
fix a lot of them today, and that should be, I think, the moral framework most people should have, rather than thinking that suffering is inherent to the universe or inherent to human nature and that it's ordained by God and that it's just something we have to live with. No, the goal should be to fix the suffering, not to simply just comfort people in suffering. And I think that's where my interest in the problem of evil stems, because it seems like the perspective people take on the origin of suffering impacts how they perceive how we should treat suffering. Should we alleviate it or should we try to solve it?
Mm. Right, and I think ultimately it's not a binary choice. That it's I think it's incumbent upon us both to work towards a more just society, a um, a world where people are clothed and fed and housed, and also recognize realistically that those who are going through the valley of the shadow of death, those who are going through their dark night of the soul, also need resources intellectually, emotionally, and to provide for that as well. So it's not a disjunctive choice, but it sounds like your focus is really on the mobilization and the practical.
But I think the disjunctive part comes in is like, if we can fix the world, if we can make it
Mm,
better, then God could have made it better because he's more powerful than we had, but he didn't. And so
mm.
there seems to be a
Well, that's
logical,
interesting.
there's like this logical dissonance that if
That
you imagine that we could solve the world, if you see it as such a thing that we can make it better, we can make the world a better place,
right.
then why didn't God do it? Because he should have been able to. And so it seems like the way
It would
most
be a new
Christians,
argument against the existence of God
yeah.
if humanity solved its own problems, the world's problems. It would be a kind of new um, evidential argument against God's existence. That's interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, and that's my take on it. That's why I think that anything that we can do, God must necessarily be able to do. He's more powerful than we are. We can solve the problems. And if we can, if you have the psychology that we can, you believe that we can, that causes a huge problem for religious belief because
Mm.
God didn't do this. And so it seems to me that most religious people have this innate belief that suffering is inherent to humanity, inherent to reality, can't be
Yeah,
solved.
I think I have a sort of clearly it must be an Augustinian view because I think you'll run against roadblocks of self-interest, of corruption, of um, things going wrong, right? That and those roadblocks will be perpetual, but maybe not. AI is uh, a new factor in this equation. So
Don't you see the pattern of history that we have been getting better, even with self interest? We've been making significant progress in making humans better, less the crime rate's been going down, murder rates have been going down, violence going down, life expectancy going up, quality of life going up. It seems like we are following a pattern of improvement.
Mm.
And even with our human faultiness, the pattern continues to grow at an exponential rate of improving people's lives, even despite our selfish self-interests impeding the rate at which that is happening.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I'm not competent to judge the kind of progress of human history. I look at humanity's capacity for war, its perfection of the arts of war, its capacity to kill at a more efficient rate. And I look at that and I think I'm not sure that's progress, but I take your point. I know what you mean.
Well, what do you mean when you say you don't see that as progress? Even though we have more efficient ways of killing, it seems to happen less often per capita. The rate of murder and war has gone down. Like we've had the long peace up until
Right.
the Ukraine war, where there's been no major wars between large countries in that 100-year period, which has never happened before in the history of mankind, as far as we can know. So even
You're
though we
very
have more,
optimistic. That's you're very optimistic. It's I'm I think I'm more either pessimistic or realistic about these things, but I certainly don't have data to argue how much murder per capita happens now vis-a-vis, say, 100 years ago. So it's an interesting thought experiment and question.
yeah, a great book by Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Natures, go through
Mm,
all of that, comparing comparative data of the level of violence across time period and how things have been improving and how the monopolization of violence by the government actually improved things overall.
mm.
But yeah, this is definitely what do you think would convince you that we are able to make progress, that we are able to overcome these? How would you falsify your position, your pessimistic position?
I don't know if I have a pessimistic position. Maybe it's more of a pessimistic disposition. Maybe it's more of a personality trait, because even if I don't know if it would be falsifiable, here's why. Because even if we came to a point where wars were eliminated, where everyone had a home, where everyone was fed, I know there'd be a part of me that would say, well, let's see what happens next, you know. Um, so, but like I said, that is less of a position that I would argue in a thesis driven paper, and more of an instinct or a disposition that I think I'm sort of always waiting for the corruption to ruin it, for the self-interest to puncture the kind of idealistic vision. But it's less of an argument and more of a disposition.
So you think that the self-interest would prevent us from achieving that?
Yeah, I do.
Why do you think
Naturally,
that? Why do you, because it's like obviously we can, do you think it's logically impossible to have selfishness but to also achieve?
I'll just give you an example. COVID starts, right? COVID
Yeah.
starts. And what happens is not that everyone starts sharing their toilet paper. That's not what happens. COVID starts, and there's a sense, just a sense, that resources might be finite, and immediately we start hoarding toilet paper, just as a kind of example, anecdotal, clearly. But so yeah, I'm a little more pessimistic, but I kind of like your optimism, and sort of wish I was a little more optimistic. So I'll reflect on that.
Gotcha. I see it as like selfishness as a factor, but I don't think the factor of selfishness is enough to overcome the progress of technology and science. I don't think that
Mm.
no matter how selfish we are, we'll never be selfish enough to
Maybe you
be
think
able to,
AI will take us past the corner of that, of our selfishness. That AI will lead the way.
for
Um,
sure.
yeah,
Well, we do have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
yeah, sure. I'd be glad to try to engage some questions. Sure.
Foxtrot Red asks, how does he know that the God of the Jews is the real God of the universe and the demiurge?
I don't claim to know that. I don't remember making that claim.
Yes, that question like to everyone. It's like a general question. Next question was from Winston's mom. Would you please ask Matt, is he familiar with the Enneagram and how it relates in Christianity to virtue and vice?
Enneagram? Is that the Enneagram, like the personality?
Maybe? I have no idea. I don't know what it is.
Okay, this so all I can say about the Enneagram is that I'm an Enneagram 9, which means that I'm a peacemaker. I love peace, and how the Enneagram relates to other areas is beyond my competence.
Gotcha. Church of Entropy asked, why is selfishness bad?
I don't recall arguing that's bad. I tried to simply observe that selfishness is or self-interest seems to be an operative human condition that could impede or obstruct cooperative efforts.
Gotcha. All right, I think that's it for the questions. It was a great conversation. We've been going for about an hour. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Oh, sure. I'll send Jeff, who's been really gracious, a link that he can send out maybe.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, you too. Thank you.